Okay, well, hello, everybody. I'm Roger Waldinger, Professor of Sociology, Director of the Center for the Study of International Migration, and I am delighted to welcome you to today's session. Today's session is a little different. As usual, we are co-sponsoring this with our friends and colleagues at the Center for Comparative Immigration Studies at UC San Diego, but this is, here we have a broader set of co-sponsors, the Center for European and Russian Studies, and also the USC Levin Institute for the Humanities, who, and it's the USC Center that has been responsible for bringing Professor Nancy Green to spend the month in Los Angeles. So we're very grateful to them. I just want to say a word about future programming before very briefly introducing Nancy. So we're coming to the end of spring quarter, but we have two more events coming up. Next week, a workshop on historical record linkage, a new frontier in immigration research, with to be conducted by Peter Catron, who's assistant professor of sociology at University of Washington, and Santiago Perez, a professor of economics at UC San Diego. And then we'll end our spring session with a book talk by Phi Su, who will present her new book, The Border Within Vietnamese Migrants, Transforming Ethnic Nationalism in Berlin, published by Stanford University Press, and with a discussion by Irene Blomrad from the UC Berkeley Department of Sociology. So today I'm delighted to present Professor Nancy Green, who's here from the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris. And Nancy will talk to us today about transnationalism and walls, history and limits. And following her presentation, I'll give a comment. We'll then turn the floor back to Nancy, and then we will open the discussion up for comments, questions from the audience. Please either raise your hand using the raise hand function or send me a comment in the chat. So without further ado, Nancy, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Roger. And I think, let's see, I'm trying to see how I can do this. Okay, I'm something a little odd about my, okay, whatever. Okay, I can't, I thank everybody enough. I'm delighted actually to have made it to Southern California. Obviously in these Zoom times, yeah, it is nice to be able to bring people in with little cost, but it's also nice to be able to be invited and to be able to come and hopefully to see people. And I have been able to see people while I'm here, which has really been a pleasure, so that, and hopefully as these restrictions will continue to decrease, we will still be able to travel and see each other in person. But this is part of actually my, let's see, there's a little message there. Okay, this is actually though part of the whole topic that I want to talk about today, and about things that I am concerned about. I worry a lot, like a lot of us. These are worrying times, and for those of us who have been around a while now, so those, and I'm saying that it's worrying also kind of in terms of what we do as scholars. So, and I've had several decades now of doing this, but for anyone, and those of you who are the younger generation, I think anyone with a sensitivity to 20th century history, you know, who would have thought that the 21st century would see war in Europe? I wrote the specter of war, but we're now seeing war. But this renewed Cold War, along with the resurgence of never extinguished racism and anti-Semitism, and the most brazen use of words, which, you know, brings also a new questioning to our own thoughts about the linguistic turn. But the use of words that confound their meaning and do so explicitly, from fake news to legitimate political discourse. So I worry as a citizen, I worry as an educator, I worry as an academic, and I worry about what we do as researchers and how we do it. So I'm always thinking about that as well in our, and like our own processes, our own practices. Now, some of what I say today may be specific to historians, and so I'd like to hear how this resonates similarly or differently with different disciplines, sociologists, anthropologists, or any other disciplines that might be represented in the room today, the Zoom room. Interdisciplinarity is important for many of us, and it's often kind of, made to be the wave of the future, or at least something that's very important to do, even in various calls for papers or calls for conferences or calls, even projects, research projects. But I think there are also still disciplinary differences. And so that's why I'm always interested in hearing how different disciplines, what they think about what historians do, for example, and that we can then add what we think about what other disciplines are doing. So I'd like to offer this as a reflection of a historian, or how a historian living abroad, mind you. So I've been living in France for more decades than I ever thought I would have imagined. And how you can see how we can all see the rise and perhaps fall of transnationalism as lived experience yesterday as well as today, and as academic inquiry. I will, of course, be situating this within migration studies writ large. And so first, I'd like to start with a few comments on the term itself, transnationalism. It's a great term. It's a great term. If it's loosely used, but it's I think a great term that was had sort of an immediate sort of sense to it. So the thing is, it's often spoken in the same breath as global history, world history, comparative history, connected history, circulations. And although, as you probably all well know, the proponents of each of those terms often, or those approaches or those methodologies, will and have striven to disentangle and differentiate how their term is different and better usually than another. But I am struck by so there are attempts to kind of disentangle, differentiate the meanings of global history, and there are differences, and transnationalism, connected history, etc. But I'm struck by the interconnectedness of it, and how often the terms are used as a kind of in a kind of an equivalent manner, or used together. But I think we've, and for our field, I think we've also noted how transnationalism can sometimes be used very loosely as simply a synonym or a substitute for the term migration. So huge debates have occurred over every syllable in the term transnationalism, every part of it. First of all, about the trans, how does it differ from internationalism? A graduate student piped up one day, leading to an interesting digression on the first, second, third, fourth internationals. Also, of course, international studies has, as its own field, has kind of been reinventing itself, and also thinking about things that are closer to transnational. But many other debates have involved, and particularly the term nation within transnationalism. So, is it possible to study transnationalism only since the Treaty of Westphalia or since the French Revolution? And so these have been, I think, substantive issues for historians and others, what to even situate transnationalism in what time period, and how to use the word, this word nation, which is within it, how important is it, or how pertinent is it, or how much does it limit us to a certain use of the term transnationalism. Last but not least, and I give a little shout out to Donna Gabaccia, that there have been questions about the ism. So I do not, however, Donna pointed out in an earlier talk that that ism may mean an ideology. My response is that I don't use it as an ideology. I do use the term as lived experience, but maybe incorrectly, or maybe the ism can be a bit misleading, but I'm not sure what else to call it. So I myself use the term transnationalism or the transnational, sometimes a bit loosely, to talk about migrants, of course, about mobility, but also about, obviously, the connections to the home countries. As a historian, though, I have two concerns. One has to do with history, and the other has to do with historiography. So first of all, with regard to history, when and how, just to introduce these two briefly, when and how has transnationalism appeared as an experience in the past, And that's what historians, we do, and we look at the past to see when certain things have occurred. And I'm personally interested in the last couple of centuries of mass migration, but I am ecumenical about the long term. I mean, and I'll talk a little bit about this later, but how longer timeframes have now also been mobilized to study transnationalism. As for the historiography, and this I'll speak a bit more about immediately, I am interested in seeing how the term has been used. And largely over the last several decades, since when it first became quite popular. But I think it's important to see how the term is used, how scholars, how academics use the term, and how and why and in what periods, and how the term has been taken up by scholars. So this issue, the historiography or a history of writing about transnationalism, is perhaps the easiest to chart. Most of us in migration studies date the appearance of the use of the term to Nina Glick-Schiller, Linda Bosch, and Christina Blanc, Zanton's 1992 programmatic publication towards a transnational perspective on migration, race, class, ethnicity, and nationalism reconsidered. So wanting to revise the whole thing. As I never fail to point out to both anthropologists and sociologists, and even to historians who are not that aware of his work in the history of the United States, that an Australian historian of US history had launched the term at about the same time. In fact, a year earlier in 1991, Ian Terrell had published an article in the American Historical Review called American Exceptionalism in an Age of International History. And this spawned new writing focusing on the transnationalism and internationalism of US history. This then in subsequent works by Thomas Bender, who edited Rethinking American History in a Global Age, et cetera. So there have been various, anthropologists, historians using the term and programmatically wanting to push the term as something important from the beginning of the 1990s. There were other early uses by sociologists, including Peggy Levitt's The Transnational Villagers, that dates to 2001. I'm always keen on seeing when things appear. Robert Smith in 2005, Mexican, New York, and Alejandro Portes, who first used the term, it seems, in a 1996 article in the American Prospect. But it's the takeoff of the term which intrigues me, and that takeoff does date to the early 1990s. But we can see there were uses of it before, and in a really useful article, Pierre Saunier, in that dictionary of the Palgrave Dictionary of Transnational History, he did the main article on transnationalism. It's one of these dictionary projects he edited with Akira Irie. That came out in 2009. He pointed out, and this was news to me when I read that, is that there had been prior use of the term by political scientists in the 1970s. Actually, even before that, the term transnational highways, whoever remembers that, that there were reference to the transnational highways that was sometimes a synonym for the transcontinental US highway system, this being used in the early part of the 20th century, but this you only find through, a database search. I don't think any of us would have thought of that. Saunier pointed out, however, about the political scientists, whom I then started to look up because they tried to launch the word in the 1970s. And it's interesting when there is an attempt to use a term and then it doesn't take hold. So I went back to look at the discussion of and how it was launched by Robert Keohane and Joseph Nye, and how they were kind of early adopters, we'd say now, and how it did not lead to success. Why? It was intended to question the economic and civil society challenges to state policy and to state power. But ultimately it failed to catch on. And early on, doubters started saying, well, but the transnational actors that they were referring to, particularly NGOs, for example, as examples of transnationalism, that they themselves said, the critics of the use of the term at the time, they said that even the NGOs are ultimately dependent upon political and interstate relationships. And so in the 1970s, the doubters objected, I could say already, that the state was not withering away so quickly, and the term did not take off. In the 1990s, however, and since, transnationalism has found its audience, and largely thanks to the anthropologists pointing out how immigrants remain connected to their homelands, whether sending back, remittances and packages, whether building houses back home, whether subsidizing social, cultural, or political activities there. But if transnational has really become the word of the day among many scholars of migration, it has been used in other fields as well. So there's a Routledge book series, for example, called Ideas Beyond Borders, Studies in Transnational Intellectual History. Now, at the beginning, and I think many of you know this, there was, kind of initial pushback in the 1990s against the heralding of this innovative term. In what I've called the Newness Debate. Many historians of migration asked, so what's new? And often also even in meetings in Paris or in the United States, I kept saying, well, immigration historians have been really studying transnationals for a very long time. And so the notion was that, what's new about the concept if you look at past migrations. David Gerber, whom you may know, was one of the first to raise this issue of the complaint of the plaint of the historians in an article in 2000 called Theories and Lives. Then there was an issue of the Journal of American Ethnic History, which took this on more generally in 2006 and raised the historians of migration objections to, or seeing how, to what extent were we already working on transnationalism and what might be new about it or not. So that being said, the term took off, and migration historians, as many of you know, then also got into the act and have now also looked for other forms of connections and studying, the transnational relations of migration, of migrants. And it's nice, don't you think, to have a term that takes off. I tried post-structural structuralism. Didn't make the same sort of splash. You maybe too many syllables. You have to have something that's really, seems to kind of be, as the word transnationalism seems to be the word, is perhaps particularly amenable to success. It is succinct, it's clear, it's sort of intuitively understandable. Although I must say it can produce quizzical looks at a non-academic cocktail party when people are not into our field and are not really that convinced of what it is. But most importantly, and I think for us as academics, it is in tune with the times. And so this is something that has always struck me, that the timing of its emergence. Michael Lang pointed out in an article, 2006 article in the Journal of Modern History called Globalization and Its History. He talks about how those years of the 1980s and 1990s were the years of the takeoff of globalization talk in general. The historically situated reasons for that are many that we know. The neoliberalism of the Reagan-Thatcher era, the 80s, the demise of the Soviet Union at the end of the 80s, and then the end of the wall in 1989, and then the end of the Soviet Union in 1991. Also European expansion, of the consolidation, the creation of the European Union at Maastricht in 1993. And I would add, in general, a concomitant post-structure epistemological shift from structuralism to post-structuralism, with a new emphasis on the subject, on the individual's agency, clearly rebelling against constraints of all sorts, but also, the pulling away from questions of class, questions of more collective nature, and so a new emphasis on the individual and on the subject, and the subject rebelling against constraints, or rebelling against structures of all sorts, whether they be political or economic. So what better symbol for all of this than the dismantling of the Berlin Wall? And one could hope, or one had hoped, that walls were now a thing of the past, that borders would follow suit. And at that point, some scholars, and some of the historians among them, anticipated the end of the nation state, perhaps as some of the political scientists were trying to do in the 70s. I heard historians at meetings, argue that this meant also the end of our profession as we know it or knew it, know it, that is organized around area studies and nation state fields. I sat in on meetings where even the historical study of the past formation of the nation state was poo-pooed, suggesting that it was a thing of the past. Although it always struck me that as historians, we study the past. So you don't, things that have happened in the past, even if they no longer exist, doesn't mean you can't study them. But it was kind of the notion that, there was no point in studying this since it would, as much as we had in the past, since the nation states were no longer going to exist. So much for the historians' predictive powers, but then we are, historians and not futurists. Arguably, then one could say that the 1990s, when transnationalism was born, the use of it, as a scholarly agenda, was perhaps the 1990s, perhaps a moment unto themselves. That the kind of silly optimism of Fukuyama's, with this book called The End of History. I mean, what historian could actually ever think that this was a serious concept, the end of history? But in any case, this period, I think, was, shut down seriously by September 11th. And so I think there is this decade where there is a kind of a flourishing of a lot of, reflection on transnationalism and globalization, much of which continues, and with good reason as well. I'm not, naysaying the whole project entirely, but I do think that we have to think about how it was situated, how it emerged, in what time period it's situated, and the writing about it is situated, and to think about that. But then we can come back to the question, not just of the historiography, but of the history. So when exactly has transnationalism occurred? Again, the historians, we've been arguing that it has occurred in the past, and so it's not entirely new. The other thing that happened is that historians of migration came around to transnationalism. And not only that, but historians in different fields and not necessarily in migration history, the subject became popular, and the term has worked its way for historians backwards. So early modern historians, medieval historians, ancient historians have now all found transnationalism in the movement of peoples, in the movement of goods, in the movement of ideas. So going back to, early periods, which only again proves that transnationalism is not new, but it's everywhere you look. But this is a basic point of scholarship, is that, if only you look, you shall find. So, medievalists, ancient historians, early modernists have also now found transnationalism. And arguably, though, this issue of the nationalism and transnationalism, that arguably we have been blinded by that the interest of the transnationalism was to go beyond nationalism or national focus. And of course, the well-cited article by Andreas Wimmer and Nina Glick-Schiller pointed out that methodological nationalism has been something that we need to go beyond. So research has been, much historical, and that article dates to 2002. So there had been a decade there where transnationalism was, surely, proposed as something that could help us go beyond nationalism, and I think that it has. But it's true that much historical and sociological research has been a study of history within borders. But there is a great debate over methods of burrowing, or I don't know if this word exists, furrowing, but in-depth knowledge of a time and a place, or more widespread comparative questions that go beyond borders. So not only has, and this, I would put in again a plea for the interest of transnationalism. So not only has it expanded our own intellectual borders, but now the earlier historians of the medieval ancient periods are also expanding the temporal framework for understanding transnationalism, and this is quite interesting. But particularly because they've shattered an idea which was, I think, common for contemporary historians, or notions about the contemporary world, which is that there was a static past and now a mobile present, and that's what describes or defines even the present. So now mobility has been found everywhere and at every period, from the long past to the present. New historiographic questions and new findings have led to new answers, highlighting the circulation of objects and people in the past. from Greek vases circulating to medieval soldiers and scholars and early modern travelers to the industrial era and the train, which are the ones that we contemporary historians focus on. The steamship, the jet plane. Sure, the nation in transnationalism can be a misnomer for earlier periods before the nation state, before industrialization. But the point is that what can we use maybe even in the term transnationalism to replace nation? Transborderism doesn't really have that good of a ring to it. This is where, like, if you want to come up with a good word, it should have a good ring to it. But the point is that neither industrialization nor contemporary globalization have a monopoly on the historic practice of transnationalism. And so this is what we've learned from the historians of earlier periods. The obvious point, though, in using transnationalism, and I repeat myself, is that as scholars, we find what we look for. When we ask new questions, we find new results. So, and this can be even in old sources. So once we took transnationalism seriously, we could re-find it in the past. For historians, old sources read anew with new eyes led to new discoveries of past activities. And even historians of migration could now emphasize, beyond the persistence of ethnicity, more frequent connections with the homeland than had previously been seen by the sources or by historians looking at certain sources. Mobility, so highly prized today, turns out to have been there all along, if via somewhat slower modes of travel. And then I'll get back to this in terms of some questions at the end. These discoveries then of past transnationalism have been exciting news for historians and others, although sociologists and anthropologists might gripe about the déjà vu insistence of historians as kind of killjoys, that, oh yeah, right, we've already seen this. But it does lead one to ponder, interdisciplinarily speaking, how do we define newnesses, past and present, and how do our perceptions of newness change over time? Letters, the telegraph, Skype, FaceTime, each of these have their own timing and their own sense, but what we see today is very slow in the past was sometimes seen as actually very fast at the time at which they were invented in the past. So again, these are some things we can come back to. But I think, we can remember that the late 19th century travelers were wowed by the incredible speed of steamships over sailing ships, of communication by cable or telegraph over letters. And each new technology has its own kind of, oh, wow moment. And the kind of conviction that it is new and, better than everything that preceded it. And that's what many historians feel about, or scholars feel often about their research. Newer and better than anything that preceded. So that being said, the discovery, and I would say in quotation marks, of transnationalism past and present, it has been exciting and has resulted in very important work, analyzing in new ways connections, mobility, and the circulation of goods, ideas, and people. It's given added credence to individual agency, past and present, and there are great stories about the ingenuity of border crossers, of translators, brokers, in-between people, in-betweens, greasing the wheels of exchange of all sorts. So what about the walls? And what about the limits to transnationalism? Will the walls and the war lead to another historiographic shift, not to mention the virus, away from the heralding of transnationalism to a renewed interest in the state or to other types of obstacles that can be in the path of forms of transnationalism? Do we shift from optimism to pessimism in these glum times, far from the euphoria of the fall of the Berlin Wall? Now, already there have been people, scholars questioning the shift to transnationalism, and already in 2000, so even before September 11th, Sally Westwood and Annie Fazaclia wrote a book entitled Transnationalism, with a hyphen between trans and nationalism. So you can always tell also how new words come into the vocabulary, sometimes with either quotation marks or hyphens, and then later become kind of normalized. Anyway, they argued already for the continuing importance of the nation state, and they were not alone. There have been other skeptics along the way, and not just the historians pushing back against the disciplines of the new. We got over that. and we started to use the term. But among more historically minded sociologists and anthropologists, such as Roger Waldinger, David Fitzgerald, but also Eva Moravska, Nancy Foner. There have been already more cautionary tales about the past. And even Nina Glick-Schiller backpedaled somewhat on the newness argument. And there has been a questioning of the content of transnationalism and of its continuity over time. So one of the things I want to do is kind of see how we've gotten from there to here and some of the questions that have been raised. So you all surely know Rogers and David's 2004 article, Transnationalism in Question, in the American Journal of Sociology. And this shout out is not just a way of thanking them again for inviting me to participate in this workshop, but it is an important article. In the book then that Roger and I co-edited, A Century of Transnationalism, we wanted to show how transnationalism has both existed over a long time, so not just a new thing, but also how it's been uneven over the last century, and how states' interventions have always had an impact on the possibilities and premises and the promises of transnationalism. So geopolitics and war intervene. A striking example that's in the book is that of Monica Reisa-Spoon talking about Japanese in Brazil, and how both on the part of the Brazilian state and the Japanese state, there was an encouragement and some subsidies for Japanese in Brazil to explore, have their own cultural activities, etc. In the period before World War II. But then once war broke out, obviously, I mean, these things were halted. And so, I mean, what we see, and we know, of course, in the US, to speak German or, during World War I was verboten and out in the street, and how there are, even ways of expressing one's transnationalism that can be limited. And it may be too easy to take the example of a moment when home and host countries go to war. And naturally, that's when transnationalism takes a hit. But there are more subtle examples along the way in peacetime when transnationalism can wax or wane due to states' encouragements or discouragements, due to the diminishing enthusiasm of immigrants, etc. And so, in fact, in about the same period when we published the book together, Roger published his own book, The Cross-Border Connection, 2015, showing how immigrants to the US have changed and how declining relationships with the homelands happen over time. And I came out with The Limits of Transnationalism, which was another way of looking at how historically states and immigration states in particular have complicated the possibility of free movement. Now, I hasten to say we all knew that the state policies with regard to entry, with regard to immigration, have always placed barriers to mobility. But we had seen less, talked or studied less, was also how the immigration states have various ways in which they may frown upon the leaving of their citizens. And in any case, the other point was, and I'll get back to this, is that networks themselves among kith, kin, or an individual's attachment to their home state do not always work. And that's another premise of the transnationalism, which I think we can see historically does not always work. So there are two aspects to questioning an unfettered enthusiasm for transnationalism, to which I can return. One is the history, and the other is the historiography. There are limitations on mobility, and we're seeing them in our really very predominantly and dishearteningly in our own time with walls, the virus, and now the war. But limitations have always existed in the past. So this is not just new to the last decade or so. And I argue further that it's not just a question of history, but of the way in which transnationalism has been presented historiographically as a post-structural liberal alternative to earlier tales of structural oppression. And in that respect, once again, it had a purpose. It has a purpose. I like to cite Paul A. Kramer, a scholar of empire, who complained that, rather jocularly, that transnational works, I quote, sometimes convey a breathless sense of freedom, while historians of the imperial produce grim accounts of domination domination. But what he was pointing to is how the stories about transnationalism did and have taken a rather upbeat, optimistic view of the possibilities of what can be done contra the structures of various aspects. So there are various ways of questioning the lived experience of transnationalism and not just investigating whether it is something historically new. And as the examples show in the book that Roger and I edited, but others have shown as well, that transnationalism varies over time, even within the last century, that the state persists in placing obstacles in migrants' paths. This is eminently true for the countries of immigration, but also, as I have shown, for the countries of emigration as well. And above all, individuals still get caught in the webs of state jurisdictions, and I will mention again, which some of you have already heard and may know, is that I do have to file 2 sets of tax returns. And so as we are moving into the tax preparation period, let me tell you, this is of course unique to the United States of taxing their citizens worldwide. Most other countries only tax on residents. But so I have to do it in both France and the United States. Let me say no more. It's a giant pain and it takes oodles of time. It's not the only problem that a transnational can have, but it is an irksome one. The optimism about transnationalism as setting us free, I think thus needs to be tempered by remembering state strictures and not only tax laws, but also, I argue, the limitations of networks. So let me say a few words about networks. Networks, it seems to me, have been a strong and an interesting corollary to understanding the functioning of transnationalism, and seen as... Hi, Donna, we're hearing you. Good.
Oh, sorry.
Someone's speaking. That's great. We can talk later. So networks have been kind of the glue, it seems, among individuals in these postmodern times. So, and they've been talked about a lot in terms of transnationalism. And here too, historians will pipe up. This is nothing really particularly new to historians of migration. John S. MacDonald and Leatrice D. MacDonald introduced the notion of chain migration in a well-cited paper in 1964, Chain Migration, Ethnic Neighborhood Formation, and Social Networks. And this was to explain how people ended up where they did, well before people got excited about Bruno Latour and those folks, their 1980s A&T, actor network theory. So networks and the importance of networks for migration have been noted, and we talked a lot about chain migration at one point. So this information via kith and kin led to practically, as we know, whole villages moving from Europe to the United States during the height of late 19th century transatlantic migration. Not only wives and children joined husbands and parents, but relatives sent, tips and money and already forms of remittances back to the old country, but tips also about how to move, where to go, which itineraries to take, what paths and what jobs could be available upon arrival. Many things that are talked about in the IT revolution today of the connectivity of migrants with their home, family, and friends. When the going got tough, wider networks could also be mobilized. So my favorite story, if you haven't heard of it, is that of Frank Gaydon, also known as AKA François Gaydon de Roussel, as he became known in France, whose networking left a thick file in the US State Department archives. I maybe won't go into it for lack of time, but he got accused in France of manufacturing fake wine. It turns out it's actually pretty easy, I guess, to make fake wine with a few grapes and a lot of sugar, and they found a lot of sugar in his basement, and he was accused. And in the end, he fled as a refugee to Switzerland. But in the meantime, he had mobilized a wide range of important networks. He knew a senator, a Louisiana senator was a cousin of his, a state senator. He had a very well-known brother-in-law brother-in-law in France because his sister had married a major French political figure, Joseph Caillot. His timing wasn't great. 1907, there were all kinds of problems in the wine growing districts. And it was also the period where his brother-in-law was cheating on his sister. So that actually wasn't going to help in terms of trying to get Caillot to write a letter for him. But all this wasn't perfectly apparent at exactly that moment. Anyway, he fled. And to me, he fled to Switzerland. He became a refugee, a self-proclaimed refugee. And to me, this was a story of how networks don't work. I mean, it was clear, and he had powerful networks, but he was also seems, he was really very kind of in the way in which he wrote with, capital letters and exclamation marks and stuff. He was kind of over the top, and exasperating, I think, many of the people he was writing to. But networks, I think, are one of the foundational premises to transnationalism for migrants. They don't always work, even among the elite. And if they don't work among the elite, we know that it's going to be obviously very difficult for those who are not elites and who migrate and who move or who are on the move. So there are limits, and limits that we can see in the archives, limits that we could see if we look for them again. If we look for them, we can find them in the archives. This one I didn't look for. It was a thick file in the State Department archives that just impressed me incredibly about how this guy kept writing and writing and writing and trying to get someone to help him in the US or in France. Well, perhaps this can bring us back to history and the present and its eventual impact on our research. As for the historical limitations to transnationalism, I would summarize my thoughts on the matter as: one, it is not new. Two, even in the past, when it has existed, it has been limited by state interference, which we don't think about always, or we no longer always think about, although there are plenty of examples that we do actually know about. Three, that even the networks don't necessarily work, and even though they've been postulated as being what works in transnationalism, but they can also fail at times. And more generally, I guess I'm pushing back against an optimistic overemphasis on a post-structural nature that emphasizes the agency, which a lot of people, we've all been doing, and there's been really terrific work written on individuals, written on how people have been able to overcome obstacles, etc. But I think that it has limited our attention to constraints and to structural constraints that can be either economic or political or of other forms. And so it's perhaps this overly optimistic viewpoint that comes up against now, and I think is coming up against, again, our present and our historical present and what we ourselves are, the time in which we're writing. So now we have walls, we have COVID, we have wars. I mean, I don't want to, be too pessimistic, but these are pretty grim times. I mean, and who would have thought, after the joy of dismantling, the Berlin Wall, that walls could have a comeback? I mean, this seemed impossible to me. They are the most literally concrete, visible barrier to transnationalism that is possible. Walls are set up to keep out the poor, walls to keep out refugees, walls to keep out neighbors of all sorts. In 2016, the National History Museum of Immigration in Paris mounted a temporary exhibit called Frontières, Borders. And with impressive maps, it illustrated the borders around the separating borders, old and new, around the world, from the US-Mexican border to the fences between India and Bangladesh, walls between Israel and Palestine, or between the two Koreas. But the exhibit also discussed the long history of borders within Europe, the Iron Wall, of course, but also the ways in which the Schengen Agreement kind of redefined the border of Europe, and of course how the Mediterranean, like the Rio Grande, provide often deadly liquid obstacles to movement. The array of maps showing walls all over the world was astonishing, even to those of us who thought we were well informed. And the exhibit was planned before the arrival of Syrians led to panicky barriers erected by Hungary, by Turkey, etc. It's true that concrete and barbed wire manufacturers are making a fortune. Walls are not new, from medieval ghettos to fortified cities. It's just that we thought they were just that, medieval. Modern states have used laws and immigration officials to serve the fencing function, but the physical erection of barriers shocks in its literal concretization. Even the limited mobility due to the pandemic but also, in the old times, to plagues. So it's not entirely new. But even for those of us not stopped by physical walls, the COVID virus has erected, new blockades, made us question our transnational practices. And so not to mention the new war that has just started in Europe. My questions to you are multiple, and I will conclude in this vein. Do you think that this historical moment will have an impact on how we write history or how we do sociology, on our concepts, on our analyses of the study of border crossing? As border crossings become more difficult, will there be an even greater return? There has been a return to the state, and a return to understand from social history to bringing the state back in. But in this case, will there be more studies about the ways in which states construct boundaries, borders now and of the past? Will this in turn lead to more questions about the limitations on the possibilities of individual agency? Will our optimism be dampened? More generally, my question is that of the climate in which we read and write. I would argue that we need to be more explicitly aware of the impact of our own history at the moment of writing history, sociology, anthropology. We cannot understand the enthusiasm for transnationalism as a research method or inquiry without understanding, I think, Ronald and Margaret. We can't be impervious then to the subsequent impact of September 11th. On both the fate of migrants, but also the ways in which, like the walls before our eyes, they impact our scholarly endeavors. More generally, I suppose I worry about the ways in which too great an attention to agency, an important corrective, again, to the prior heavy-handed structuralism, but how it may blind us to the structures that we need to confront collectively. One could say that the new social justice movements are doing battle with those constraints, with some of those constraints, and maybe they're a kind of post-structural structuralism in action, constructing groups that can fight against some of the other constraints that confront us. On the optimistic side, Saunier had written about a positive moral value that we tend to give to connections and circulations, and I think that's true, and particularly as against jingoistic nationalism. But that being said, I've always been actually known to be mostly an optimist, but I think maybe I've gotten a pessimistic critical side from, I don't know, from living in France too long. It's possible. But even before the walls and COVID, I had been, and I still am, impressed by all of the research on transnationalism. Yet even then, I have been skeptical of a too enthusiastic tone that emphasizes it as a methodological solution to structuralism, throwing any notions of often, not always, but often sort of abandoning a critical view to the structures that nonetheless still surround the transnational movement. If I can have another 2 minutes, I'd like to just end with 2 sets of questions, one about class, the other about interdisciplinarity. Has there been a class bias to transnationalism? Certainly in some of its earliest iterations, there have been some fascinating early studies that, looked at wealthy businessmen that kind of set the tone. Ewa Ong's great book, Flexible Citizenship, The Cultural Logics of Transnationality. In France, Anne-Catherine Wagner's important book on les nouvelles élites de la mondialisation, une immigration dorée en France, so studies of international schools and the way in which the international elite meets and creates their own communities, even while being elsewhere. I was kind of looking at transnationalism as well in my own book on the other Americans in Paris. But I have argued that if the elite have problems living between two countries, then obviously this is true for other classes as well. And so I've always pushed everyone should go to the consular archives and see what's going on there in terms of course, who goes to consulates, but it's one way of looking at problems that citizens can have in another place, and also with their own country, sometimes maybe not giving them the help that they want. But for a long time, and this is the class question, for a long time, it seemed that other groups who were transnationals, such as mafioso or human traffickers, or simply care workers, were not englobed in the term. I think that has changed a bit since then, but I think it means that we do have to think about class differentiation among transnational actors. As for interdisciplinarity, how can history help I don't know, and I would have to, you have to identify yourselves according to discipline, and to know what's the mix in the audience, this invisible audience, invisible to me, unfortunately. How can history help? Historians are often shamed for simply borrowing theory from the other disciplines. There's no question that the history of migration, that the concepts of assimilation, ethnicity, transnationalism were often developed first by sociologists or anthropologists, and how they have helped us, the historians, do archival research, the questions we've gone to the archives with. Donna Gabatia has often complained that we historians frequently cite the rest of you, I don't know, anthropologists, sociologists, but that maybe you don't always cite us. So there's a kind of an asymmetry in the use of interdisciplinarity. Maybe that's just academic nitpicking, maybe not, and goes to other issues. But again, and again, with some notable exceptions. The question, however, is one of the transmission of knowledge and of insights. What can history add to a topic or approach such as transnationalism? And beyond the newness debate, I think it really means a real engagement with questions of change over time and temporal comparisons. So again, what difference does a letter or FaceTime make? Sure, letters took longer, but at least we still have them in readable form. I mean, this is a great worry for historians about what kinds of data will be saved for the future. So just think of all those great, and I'll put in a plug here for the great 19th, 20th century immigrant letter collections at the Immigration History Research Center at the University of Minnesota, or the Center for Migration Studies of New York. There are collections of letters, and which can also give us a sense of how people at the time, they didn't think letters were slow. They were just the means by which they were, I mean, they did complain sometimes, that it was taking a while, or that they hadn't heard from their correspondent. But today people don't necessarily pick up their phone. But I think we can measure and scoff at the length of time it took for communications in the past. But we need to think about how people themselves perceived those communications, and to admit that those dimensions may take on new meanings for the future. So, for writing, it's hard for us maybe to totally have that sense of time and distance of someone in the 19th century. And yet at the same time, we are so convinced that our modes and our speediness is like the end all of all things. There could be something in the future waiting for us, which will be different. It's hard to tell. As for writing about transnationalism today, in the end, perhaps I need not worry about our forgetting about the limitations of transnationalism. And so for that, I will, within modern techniques possible to us today, I will share with you a screenshot, which, if it works, okay. Here we go. Look at this. So when I looked at the engram the other day, I see that in fact transnationalism is like over. That the use of the term, in any case, according to Google, in English, through 2019, apparently, has had a precipitous decline. This actually sort of surprises me, because a lot of the publishers seem to still like the term in the title. So what are we to do with this bit of information? So maybe there's no worry. This is the way it is, and it's over, and we shall move on to something else. I leave it to the floor, Roger. I leave it to Roger first. Thank you.
Okay, so 1 second. Okay, so thank you, Nancy, for that terrific comment. So I'm delighted to have this opportunity to reflect on Nancy's presentation, which is delivered with her unique combination of intellectual elegance and wit. Now, as Nancy notes, the extraordinary success of the transnational turn in migration studies can in part be explained as a matter of timing. The emphasis on an open world in which migrants could be successfully incorporated both here and there seemed to capture the moment, one in which walls were going down, not up, and in which the enemies of yore could be seen as one's friends. In migration studies, however, transnationalism found appeal precisely because it insisted that the connectedness highlighted by the researchers who insisted this approach represented a break with the past. And that contention, I think, turned out to be a brilliant marketing device, as novelty is always appealing, especially to social scientists who have little interest in or knowledge of history, and therefore are delighted to proclaim that the times in which they live represent something never seen before. Now, in retrospect, what could be more out of date, more obviously obsolescent, more transparently passé than the 1990s, the very decade in which transnationalism exploded? Way back then, we neither had smartphones nor social media, paper still reigned supreme, and the facts seemed cutting edge. And though for part of the time the Balkans were up in flames, one could complacently assume that this was a regional peculiarity, as one no longer needed to stay up at night worrying about the possibility of nuclear war, and all the more so as democracy seemed on the march everywhere. It was fun at the time to think that the good times would roll on forever, but alas, it just hasn't been so. So what was a novelty in the 1990s has turned out to be boringly old, with each new year in what has turned out to be a terrible century, bringing yet another cascade of disappointing news. But it seems to me it's precisely for that reason that the marketing device produced or promoted by the early promoters of transnationalism has turned out to be an intellectual dead end. A process like migration entails regular recurring features. Migration is always selective, which is why it is always the case that some people leave and other people stay behind, and that in turn creates families stretched across state boundaries, which then yields all sorts of connecting flows between here and there. By definition, international migration entails both a move into a new social environment and a shift in political jurisdiction. And so the former, that is a move into the new social environment, facilitates new ways of thinking about oneself. And the latter, the move into a new political jurisdiction, provides protection from the homeland state. And so therefore, movements organized abroad aimed at political change at home reappear whenever migrations occur. But to respond by saying plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose, it seems to me is not the right way to go. And to reiterate, some things do remain the same, but not everything. And I think what we want to do is identify both the aspects of continuity and the aspects of change, without ever assuming that what is new at any one particular moment represents the shape of things to come. And to suggest what might be gained by from such an approach, in this comment, I'm going to briefly talk about three different historical episodes in long-distance political mobilization: the Spanish Civil War and its aftermath, the Chilean exile after the coup in 1973, and Chinese dissidents and minority expatriates today. Now, the Spanish Civil War, which lasted from 1936 to 1939, provides useful materials for reflecting on the gains, if any, that have been made by the transnational turn. Now, we used to think about the massive wave of support mobilized in favor of the besieged Spanish Republic as a very exemplar of internationalism. Now, do we see anything different if we use the new vocabulary? Now, as it happens, the Civil War broke out at precisely the moment when a counter-Olympics held to protest the Olympics then being taking place in Nazi Germany was being held in Barcelona. And so, ironically, we have an example of transnationalism before transnationalism. And so, to come back to Nancy's point, so there we go with transnationalism's supposed newness. Now, the international group of anti-fascists who were then on the ground in Barcelona provided the seedbed for the International Brigade, which was a fighting force that ultimately numbered 36,000 people from 53 different countries, speaking about 20 different languages. Now, a high proportion of the brigadistas were themselves immigrants. Now, some of them, in particular Germans, Italians, Poles, were exiles, and hence they certainly couldn't have been considered the transmigrants as imagined by Nina Glick-Schiller, etc. And having fled for their lives, they couldn't live lives across borders. Now, others, in particular the Americans who volunteered in the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, were either immigrants or the children of immigrants, and indeed there was a significant number of African Americans who also fought in Spain. And for both groups of American volunteers, the fight against fascism in Spain was the first step against the fight against fascism and Jim Crow at home. And so if we think about the foreign fighters, the national and the international, or maybe the national and the transnational, were fused. Fighting for another people's freedom was a preliminary to fighting for one's own. Now, unfortunately, as we all know, the Republic went down to defeat, and with it, hundreds of thousands of Spaniards crossed the borders into France. And there they were concentrated, they were dumped into concentration camps, which the writer Arthur Kessler penned a book entitled The Scum of the Earth. Now, with the defeat of France and the advent of the occupation, it turns out that the Republicans, the exiled Republicans, made a crucial contribution to the resistance. In August 1944, a column of Spanish Republicans who had been incorporated into the Free French Army actually led the march into then liberated Paris. In October, a small army of 5,000 battle-hardened Republicans, led by Spanish communists, rolled into northern Spain, what they hoped would be the beginning of a counter-revolution or overthrowing of Franco. But that effort turned out to be disastrous because Washington and London refused to accept the opening of an anti-Franco front in the south of France. And across the political spectrum, the exiled Republicans hoped that Hitler's demise would spell Franco's end, thinking that they might be able to use the newly established United Nations, so in a sense, a transnational forum, to lobby in favor of restoration of the Republic. And as we know, in the end, the Western allies concluded that the devil they knew, that is to say Franco, was better than a regime that would possibly tilt towards the East. And as the Cold War engulfed Europe, the temporarily hospitable French soil, which had served as a supply and training base for guerrillas who were infiltrating into Spain during the late 1940s, turned hostile. Spanish Communist Party was outlawed, and its key cadres migrated eastward to the Soviet bloc. Now, what about the returned brigadistas? Many, but not all, were communists. So in a way, the quintessential transnationals. Now in the East, some of them rose to prominence in the new communist leadership, in part because of their role in the resistance, and roles that were facilitated by the experience they had gained fighting in Spain. But in the throes of the early Cold War, it turned out that the experience of fighting in the West is what made them suspect in the East. And of course, in these contexts, the suspicion heightened by the fact that many of them were Jews. In some cases, like Rudolf Slansky, heads rolled. In others fared a bit better. They were simply condemned to life imprisonment. Now, by comparison, the brigadistas in the West fared somewhat better. But what we today see as a badge of honor in the 1950s turned out to be a source of stigma, with the veterans of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade linked to America's enemy. Now, I think this is an instructive case because we can see that our conceptual vocabulary doesn't provide much help. One could say that the brigadistas exemplified a particularly militant form of transnational solidarity, but this is a form of transnational activity that seems light years removed from the types of political activity, let's say hometown associations, on which so much of our literature has focused. Now, what about the republics in exile? Were they transnationals when fighting in the French resistance? Or rather, did they become transnationals when they left France to fight underground in Spain? And we also see, and this echoes points Nancy made, that options for cross-border activity were shaped by the broader interests of states. Exiles can be instrumentally used if and when they oppose a homeland government that the host land also detests. But unfortunately for the Spanish exiles, the host lands concluded that the tolerance of the Franco regime was worth the price. And for the brigadistas, whether living in the East or the West, their prior willingness to serve a cause abroad made them suspect when international tensions put loyalties at home in question. Now, I want to turn to another September 11th, not the September 11th, 2001 mentioned in Nancy's paper, but rather September 11th, 1973, which was the day when the democratic regime led by the socialist Salvador Allende was overturned by the Chilean army. Now, the coup led to a mass migration abroad, with estimates ranging from 500,000 to 2 million. And in some ways, the Chilean experience provides an echo of the earlier Spanish tragedy, because Allende's election as the first freely elected Marxist president in Latin America gave the Chilean experience special meaning and generated a tremendous amount of worldwide attention. But although there was a lot of interest in Chile and Allende, it was only the arrival of the Chilean exiles in the West that generated a new bond of solidarity. The Chilean case became a cause célèbre in Europe, finding echoes of public officials, parliamentarians, trade unionists, etc. Mass demonstrations were organized in front of Chilean embassies. Left-wing Chilean political parties reorganized themselves, and new organizations sprang up in response to the new situation created by exile. So, in contrast to the Spanish case, the Chilean exiles weren't dumped into concentration camps, but instead reflecting the influence of the Solidarity movement and the support it elicited at high state levels. Countries throughout Europe took in roughly 50% of the exiles, as opposed to the US, which took in barely 2%. Now, the Solidarity movement in support of the exiles could be seen as an echo of the international support mobilized in favor of the Spanish Republic in the 30s, as signaled by a 1975 article in the now defunct radical journal Ramparts, entitled, quote, Chile, the Spain of our generation. But I do think that the post-coup environment shows something new, namely, and here I think we come to some of the ambiguities of the term. It saw the emergence of what we can only think of as a transnational human rights arena, and a development that in the United States was without question sparked by the reaction to the coup. And for American human rights activists, the exiles from Chile were symbolized the figure of the human rights victim. And so consequently, in driving hundreds of thousands of Chileans into exile, the junta ultimately created the conditions that would undermine its hold on Chilean society. In the end, the wave of opprobrium that was heaped upon the Pinochet regime, not simply from the exiles, but from the broader transnational arena of human rights activists, as well as the legislators and the political leaders from the latter influence, shifted the political and discursive balance against Pinochet and paved the way for the restoration of Chilean democracy. Now, both these cases demonstrate that migration moves people into a new political jurisdiction. And so in crossing state boundaries, migrants gain insulation from the power of the home state. Now, it's important to note that the level of protection is not absolute, but rather it's a matter of degree. In the Chilean case, the Pinochet regime was notorious for its effort to cripple the opposition abroad, of which the most infamous episode was probably the assassination of Orlando Letelier, the former Chilean foreign minister under Allende, who was blown up in the streets of Washington, D.C. But in the end, those efforts at cross-border repression backfired, discrediting the regime. Okay, let's move to today. That is third decade of the 20th century. And what we see today is that cross-border repression has gained new traction. And best evidence consists of the policies that are followed by China, which is simultaneously targeting dissidents and long-distance minority nationalists, but also engaged in heavier monitoring of its diaspora abroad. Now, as noted in a recent report by Freedom House, the Chinese Communist Party, quote, targets entire ethnic and religious groups, including Uyghurs, Tibetans, and Falun Gong practitioners, which together number in the hundreds of thousands globally. Over the past year alone, the list of targeted populations has expanded to include Inner Mongolians and Hong Kongers residing outside the People's Republic of China, end quote. Now, the campaigns against minority populations are longstanding, but they've escalated sharply with particular targeting, as many of us know, towards the Uyghurs. Now, ironically, the familial cross-border connections lauded by the transnational literature, and of course, again, this picks up Nancy's discussion of chain migration. That's what renders the Uyghurs, I mean, that's on the one hand, that's the raw material of transnationalism, but that's what renders the Uyghurs vulnerable. That is, that is to say, individual Uyghurs who are living in the United States are personally relatively protected, but not their relatives still in China. And they're systematically coerced in order to silence persons who enjoy greater freedom abroad. Now, let's come back to the newness. Is this campaign really new? Well, of course not. I mean, I just mentioned the Letelier case, and even more famous is that of the exiled Bolshevik Leon Trotsky, who was killed with an ice pick to the brain in Mexico in 1940. But I think it's hard to find an exact parallel to China's economic and political rise, which seems close to unstoppable. Now, exercising control over immigrants abroad takes extraordinary effort and investment. So no state can operate on foreign soil with the ease that it enjoys on home grounds, especially since movement abroad systematically renders the immigrants invisible. I mean, there's no census that will tell you who and where the people. But China's wealth, the power of its state, the influence it exercises internationally, and that's especially true for weaker states, eager for Chinese investment, as well as its technical capacity, make available in unprecedented fashion the resources needed to stretch coercive powers across state boundaries. And unlike Chile, China's wealth and power renders it immune to criticism from the transnational human rights community, and it sharply blunts the willingness of Western powers to apply the type of pressure that they may have used against Chile and other bad actors in years gone by. But it seems to me cross-border repression has another consequence. And here I want to outline or identify the boomerang effect, or by a boomerang effect different than the one conceptualized by students of international human rights activism. Now, those scholars thought the boomerang would hit repressive regimes because international human rights advocates would pressure their governments, and the governments in turn would adopt policies aimed at undermining repression abroad. But in this case, the boomerang hits Chinese nationals abroad, who are in a way like the brigadistas of old, because they fall under suspicion of acting on behalf of their country of origin. Now, For sure, it's not just long-distance repression that places the Chinese diaspora on the cloud. Political and economic rivalry with China leads in the same direction. But nonetheless, not every person who falls under suspicion is actually innocent. And as the Freedom House report notes, the United Front work coordinated by the Chinese Communist Party, quote, binds Chinese diaspora with espionage and transnational repression. So in the end, it seems to me that we see continuity as well as change. Continuity, movement across political boundaries repeatedly gives rise to immigrant efforts to effect change at home. But depending on the international constellation, that effort can be snuffed out, as in the Spanish and Chinese cases, or enabled, as in the Chilean example. But if we ask ourselves what is old and what is new, one has to conclude that there is nothing quite as old or nothing quite as obsolete as the core transnationalist claim, namely that the world is one where migrants enjoy successful incorporation at home and host societies, happily living lives across borders. It's a lovely ideal, to be sure, but alas, it simply isn't true. Okay, Nancy, to you.
Thanks, Roger, for showing also how much sociologists can get involved in history. That's one point. But the continuity and change argument, I think, also is very well put, and the examples are very good and thought-provoking. And I think that, like maybe a lot of things, ideals are great, and unfortunately, in practice, things have many more problems. Just let me just say briefly, so that there can be other comments as well. You mentioned a few things that I think are also in topics for further research. The suspicions about those who have left. So that in and of itself, and how the home country sees people who have left, and how that also changes over time. And it changes over time, not just for individuals or politically engaged individuals, but that can be the case for just general attitudes towards those who have left as being somehow traitors to the cause or traitors to the country. So I think that is actually an aspect of the question, which is interesting. Tara Zara talks about it in her book, which is looking more at kind of immigration, the countries of origin, Eastern Europe, and sometimes with, I think, a bit of sole focus on that. But in any case, I think this is a more general question that's interesting. You know, you bring up again the transnational human rights movement, and I think, and it's been used often very explicitly as the example of a transnational movement, that human rights and these kinds of movement of organizations across borders. I'm always struck by how at the time, you know, the turn of the 20th century, there were not just in the, you know, second or, you know, international, that there were the meetings, the international meetings, scientific meetings, as well as political meetings, union leaders getting together, the amount of movement, the amount of mobility in a time which has not been described as transnational, was nonetheless a moment of great movement and interaction. And I'm always asking, like, so what language were they speaking? You know, and I think that there was also a greater fluidity of different languages at the time and today, I guess, you know, much happens only in English. The question of cross-border repression, and what is it, new or old? Well, you know, looking in the archives in Paris for the turn of the 20th century, it was clear that the Russian Secret Service, they were already following the revolutionaries abroad. So this isn't new. I mean, and you say Trotsky is a great, you know, I mean, this is actually, you know, an example, which is one of the most, you know, I mean, historically prominent, or Letellier. So this is also, I think, a topic for more study. I mean, I think there could be some really good studies of that, and particularly the ways in which, and this will be my final comment on this, is that how the kind of upbeat version of how transnationalism has allowed people, and some of these social media have allowed people to be in touch, and how this is great, and how it helped people mobilize during, you know, in 2011 in the Arab world, and how they could, you know, people could get together and know. But at the same time, there's a great danger in that, because it's not just the people who are organizing that can see what's going on, but of course the countries who may not be, or the, you know, political powers who are not necessarily happy with what they're doing. So this kind of interconnectivity can have a two-edged aspect to it. So anyway, thanks, Roger, as usual, for your insights and for our ongoing discussions.
Okay,
so
thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so why don't we move forward to discussion? We have a limited amount of time, but hopefully we can have David Abraham. Let me unmute you. Hold on, let me unmute you.
Hi, well, thank you both for two very stimulating presentations, Nancy and Roger both. I learned a lot, and I'm left to put one question in a kind of crude form. So leaving aside the analytic novelty or non-novelty of transnationalist lens, like any lens, it brings some things into focus that you don't see with other lenses, and there are pluses and minuses to any one of these approaches. But I think what, rather than arguing about what's new and what's not, I see a kind of cyclicality here, and the cycle in which the most recent cycle in which transnationalism broke through, the one Nancy discussed at greatest length, was, in my view, and here's the crude part, the progressive side of the global neoliberal agenda. In the same way that human rights talk reemerged more strongly in that period, corresponding to the hollowing out of state power, the softening of borders, free markets, free movement for people, poor and rich alike, not to mention capital. The elevation of individual agency is part of the erosion of the social safety net, as much as it is the ingenuity of border crossers. So the elevation of what poor people can do is always something to look at with jaded vision. So I think what, to pick an anomalous title, you cited a lot of literature, some of which I know, some of which I don't, Nancy, but one of the anomalous titles of this period is David Bacon's book, The Right to Stay Home. The disappearance of the discussion of what happens to different kinds of people, commodities, capital, et cetera, when they move more freely in this world. And what we're seeing, both for good or ill, but whether it's the form of the Trumpist border walls or the slight revival of trade union organizing, is a rejection of this association of freedom and progressivity with openness and transnationality. And I wonder if you think, either Nancy or both of you, if this cyclicality in this field can be coordinated pretty well with the adventures of capitalism in the last century or more.
That's a fairly large view, and also of trying to look at the different kind of oscillations and waves. I think it's always intriguing, and it certainly intrigues me. On the right to stay home and maybe the pushback that one could see maybe in some kinds of movements. I don't want to characterize them, however, as being because there has become such a link of positivity to mobility, that anything that is considered to be less than that is, somehow gets a sort of can have sometimes a negative cast to it, or becomes, kind of a protectionist nationalism that, people who are afraid of something coming from the outside, whether it's some form of globalization, et cetera. As even kind of leftist economists have pointed out, it's not the globalization per se that's the problem, it's the ways in which it's used and the inequalities that it has engendered, but that those inequalities are maybe not necessarily linked to the globalization per se, but the way in which the current globalization is having an impact. So I think that those are all, certainly legitimate questions. And for immigration historians, I mean, as you know as well, the right to stay home, or even the desire to stay home, and what happens at home when some others have left. And the fact that, today I don't know the latest statistic, but there's something like, only 3% of the world population lives outside of the place where they were born, outside of the country in which they were born. So there's a lot of national migration. But so sometimes then I think think, well, then we're really looking at, the mobile few as opposed to the mobile masses. We just know that even a few moving can sometimes create, huge ripple effects depending on how it's used. And I think what we're clearly seeing is the use of migration and immigrants as political targets for purely political reasons. It's happening. I mean, it's just created in France. It's ridiculous because compared to other European countries, the number of immigrants who have come to France are much less percentage-wise, but the use of it for political reasons has become egregious. So these are things I think we also have to think about, is the way in which these concepts are used, and so we'll hopefully have time to talk about that in another moment.
Okay, terrific. Thank you. Min Kim.
Hello?
Yes,
Hi.
hi, we hear you.
Okay, great. So thank you so much for that talk and for your very interesting perspective as a historian, Dr. Green. And it's funny because I'm actually also an alum of UHSS, so it's kind of intriguing to meet you like this. But I guess my question is more in the form of what you emphasized during your talk, which is the lived experience of actual transnational migrants. As someone who's currently an international student right now and has been an international student several times, and as well as an international worker, and I think I would consider myself a transnational, because also in many of these times I voted for my own country. So unlike American citizens, I don't have to file taxes, but I do vote. So I am politically still involved. But it seems strange for me to hear, once I got into transnationalist literature, from a sociological perspective, by the way, so I'm studying sociology at UCSD, it struck me as really weird that, well, given the optimism of the concept, there's very little on those who become transnationals involuntarily. And somewhat I find that my own lived experience reflects that, because as I've been, as I said, I mean, an international student and an international worker many times, it's not so much that I engage in this kind of lifestyle because I wanted to, but really mostly because the expiry date on my visa. So the actual existence of borders and border policies kind of precluded my ability to not live a transnational lifestyle. And on the other extreme, as Dr. Waldinger brings up, are the precedents of essentially stranded exiles, political exiles. And yet the transnational literature, and probably is not the fault of historians. I mean, it's mainly, it is, as you said, the sociology side that's coined the term. I just don't see these populations represented. And yeah, I'm wondering if whether from the historian side or the sociology side, we'll get there. And also, due to a personal project of mine, I'm going through the Correlates of War database to kind of see which countries were implicated as neighboring conflict zones, by year from 1951 to 2018. And let me tell you, the 1990s, which as you said, is when this transnationalism concept was like high flying and very positively embraced and conceptualized. The 90s by far has the heaviest number of countries in conflict, and makes me wonder, this, despite the optimistic use of the term transnationalism, this might actually be the period when we had the largest number of involuntary transnationals, whether in the form of political exiles or maybe someone caught between borders and emerging new border policies as new countries emerge. So anyways,
yeah, no,
that's my question.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point, the involuntary transnationalism. But it makes me also think about how we've struggled often, I mean, in the literature and in reflection on this, about the differences between, let's say, and this is different than what you were talking about, but between refugees and immigrants, or between forced and free migration, given that there are various forms of migration which seem to be free or voluntary and yet have been, forced by unhappiness with conditions at home, whether that's political, economic, or of another nature. So, but I think you've got something there, and I might just suggest there's one literature which isn't necessarily, there is a literature on student migration. There's also increasing literature on women who follow their husbands around. So this is sometimes elite migration in particular, but so there has been literature on the kind of unhappiness, and actually there's sort of known, alcoholism among American women in Paris. I mean, this is not a major plague, but it has been given just as an example that it's difficult. So this is a different category. It's a question of also of class. But I think that the notion, though, that there are those who move willingly and those who for other reasons move less willingly, it's a good point in general. At the same time, it's sometimes hard for us to make those distinctions, but I think your examples are good ones and something that we could also think about. Thank you.
Okay, terrific. Unfortunately, we're coming very close to the close, so I won't have time to call everyone whose hand is up. So, I suggest you contact Nancy directly.
Yeah, or if they gave very short questions and all together, and then maybe I could give a very short answer. So I don't know, just so.
Okay, well, let's start with Ilana Zilberg.
Okay.
Hi, I'll try to be quick. I was one of those people who experienced the wrath, Roger's wrath, at a conference in 2003 in San Diego, when I was reporting back on my research on the phenomenon of deported gang youth from the US to back to countries like El Salvador. And that has stayed in my mind for a very long time. I was a relatively young scholar at the time. But at the time, for me, the utility of the term transnationalism was not about the newness or the positive, optimistic side of things, but rather it was very useful. It was useful methodologically in terms of doing ethnographic research on the ground, and to say, as you say, Nancy, to sort of understand the lived experience of, by and large, forced transnationals. And part of the forced was through deportation, not just for forced migration of refugee flight, but return migration as a result of deportation and the criminalization of immigrants on the ground in response to these flows that in great part had been induced and produced by US actions abroad. And so to me, it was never a particularly positive term. And I also found it very, so as I say, primarily methodological, because you couldn't really talk about what was going on, say, in LA, without talking about what was going on in El Salvador and vice versa. And in that sense, methodologically, it had to be a transnational study, but also because it seemed that nationalism itself was producing these transnational forms. And so I never saw these things as separate or oppositional, but in fact that they worked in relationship to each other. So that is my comment.
Okay, but we have really 2 minutes. So why don't you respond, and then, well, unfortunately, we'll have to bring this discussion to a close. I'm sorry.
Okay, well, I think that there is a very good point about the nationalism producing transnational forms. I mean, and this is where, for the contemporary period, in any case, and we had actually in one of the, for a longstanding research seminar in Paris that I did with colleagues, among whom were Michael Werner, who's worked on crossed, or histoire croisée, or crossed history. I don't know how it works in English. We talked about, I mean, this was one of the questions, was to what extent what's the nationalism in transnationalism, or the national in transnational? So I think that's a very legitimate point, but it brings me back to the question of kind of the limits of transnationalism, or how, in this case, you're saying that it's been forced by the states, basically, which is more than just saying that the states are limiting people's movement. Here, they're forcing them. But that is true for war and other, forms of conflict. In this case, and of course, for all deportations. It could be an interesting way of looking at deportation. I mean, but I think that both of this and the previous question are pointing out those elements of which go, frankly, against what irritated me was the overly optimistic view of transnationalism as something being one of the actors, the subject's agency. So this doesn't surprise me, and I think it definitely can be thought about in that respect. And so, how are the states intervening and, in this case, forcing a transnationalism? But at the same time, we know through war, we know through, all of the refugee movements that this is not just, one form of it. So deportation is one form, but of course, war and other conflicts is another, enormous form. I mean, there are a lot of these things that we know about, but I think that had gotten sort of, dismissed in a certain view of and a certain use of the term. So, but as a methodology for research, I think, it still is something very, very interesting and needs to be looked at. But with all of the aspects involved, what the individual can do and what the individual cannot do and why.
Okay, well, I'm very sorry to have to bring this terrific discussion to an end, but we've reached a border that's got to be crossed. So thank you very much, Nancy, for a terrific presentation. Thanks everyone who has joined us. A reminder, we are meeting again next Friday and the Friday thereafter, and then we'll take a break and we will begin again in spring quarter. So have a great weekend, everybody. And thank you so much. And sorry for ending a great discussion early.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
everyone. And thanks for the comments as well.